I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us once again, one of our favorites. He's a former Assistant Treasury Secretary in the Reagan administration, father of Reaganomics, Ph.D. in economics. We're talking about Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Roberts, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Pleased to be with you, Greg.
Your latest article, incidentally, you're also editor at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm just skimming over your resume, but you wrote a stinging article and basically accused the Fed of some nefarious things in terms of bond buying overseas. You titled the article, "The Fed is the Great Deceiver." We're talking about the bonds bought supposedly by Belgium from the United States a lot. Tell us why the Fed is the great deceiver.
Well, we know that Belgium didn't have any money to buy $141 billion worth of bonds over a 3-month period. That sum comes to 29% of the Belgian GDP. So they don't have a surplus in their budget of 29% of their GDP. And they don't have a trade or current account surplus of that amount. In fact, everything is in the red. Their budget deficit is in the red, and their trade and current accounts are in the red. So Belgium didn't have the money, and yet it managed to pick up $141.2 billion of U.S. Treasuries in a 3-month period. So where did they get the money? We know that the central bank couldn't have printed the euros to buy the bonds with because Belgium central bank can't print euros. Belgium is part of the euro system and has lost the ability to create its own money supply. So the only source for that kind of money would have been the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve felt that it needed to hide the fact that it was buying $141 billion worth of bonds over a 3-month period when it officially was reducing or tapering the quantitative easing down to $65 billion. It didn't want to have to admit that it was really purchasing $112 billion a month, almost double the announced purchases. I think also the Fed did not want it to get out that some large country was unloading treasuries. Somebody dropped over 100 billion in treasuries in 1 week. And if that was a large holder and that became known, it could panic smaller holders. You could see a stampede, and the Fed could lose control of interest rates. So I think the Fed thought the best thing to do was to launder its purchase through a different country and thereby disguise what was actually happening. Another curious aspect of it, the transaction was not cleared through the normal Federal Reserve clearing mechanism. It was cleared through some sort of clearing system in Belgium. This is unusual as well. So it looks like the whole thing was intended to be hidden so as to not raise questions that could be problematic for the Fed's ability to keep the house of cards standing.
What does this tell you about does this sound like a desperation move to you? What does this tell you about their thought behind the wall of the Fed?
Well, I think it must have meant that there really wasn't any market buyer for $104 billion in 1 week. And so if that kind of money sat, that kind of bond sale sat unattended, interest rates would rise. And so the Fed had to buy the bonds in order to protect its interest rate policy. But if it outright bought them, and this was known, then it starts to interfere with the tapering that it promised to do, because all of a sudden it's not tapering, at least not for those 3 months. And it signals somebody is unloading treasuries, and that could stampede others. So I think that's why the Fed did that. And what it indicates is they're not feeling all that confident that the dollar is on such a sound footing, or that the U.S. financial system is on such sound footing that they can openly step in to take up that type of a purchase.
Well, speaking of the U.S. financial system, not on a very sound footing, and they just came in with the best they can make it look is the growth in the first quarter, 0.1%, and that's down from the fourth quarter. If you believe their numbers, for 2.6%, that is a massive drop-off. But I know it's the weather. What say you?
Yes. What I find most amusing about this is that they had to claim some real growth in the first quarter. So they eked out a 0.1%. Now we know they got that by rigging the inflation number that they used to deflate the gross domestic product. And the real GDP in the first quarter, properly deflated, was negative. And probably also in the fourth quarter. And most likely this coming quarter, they're not going to be able to hide the fact that it's negative. You see, today, I think it was today, they released the retail sales, but it's not inflation adjusted. It's nominal. So
adjusted for inflation, it's a lot less than what it is. Even if you use their numbers. They couldn't
even get 0.1% this time. They had something like 0.09%.
You're saying the growth is negative for the fourth quarter, for this first quarter, and you're thinking the current quarter is all going to be negative. Is that what you're predicting in reality?
I'm convinced the first quarter is negative, and I don't see how it could possibly go positive in the second quarter. And I'm pretty much convinced by John Williams that we've really not had any real growth since the collapse in 2008, that the economy has never really come back into positive territory. It all depends on what inflation number you use to deflate the nominal GDP. And if you use the official one, then you can produce a positive growth rate. But anyone who buys energy or food or anything for that matter knows that the inflation rate's not 1% or 1.2%. It's much higher. And if you use Williams' estimates of what the inflation is, then there's no real growth since the downturn in 2008.
Are we coming to an inflection point here in your mind? I mean, I know it's hard to pick a date, and I'm not asking you to forecast, it's going to blow up on, June 13th, 2014. But are we, in your your respected position, my humble opinion, but in your respected position, are you starting to see that were we going to reach an inflection point here? I mean, where they're just not going to be able to hide that the economy is a mess despite the massive amounts of money printing that's been going on?
Well, very little of that money has gotten into the economy. It's gone into the stock market and the bond market.
That's why you're seeing record high after record high.
And into bank reserves. It hasn't really gotten into the economy, and that's why there's no growth. You see, the consumers don't have any growth in real income. So if you have a consumer economy and nobody's income is growing up except a few mega rich, you can't drive the economy. And I just saw yesterday a report that says that 83% of next month's university and college graduates have yet to find a job. 83% of the graduating class in April have not found a job prior to their graduation next month. Well, that is an indication that there aren't any jobs. As you know, in my day, when we graduated, we had 2 or 3 job offers each. So 83%, no jobs. They graduate next month, no jobs. So that, I think you're onto something when you suggest that maybe they're running out of the ability to manage the perception of the economy. They've done a good job. Of course, the financial press is corrupt, and it helps them. But if you just look at the bare facts, there's no significant growth in real consumer income. So what drives the economy? There's no growth in consumer credit except for student loans. There's no growth in retail sales. So how do you get that combination of things to give you a growing real GDP? Can't be done.
Fed Chair Janet Yellen has been on saying that, the economy is really going to start growing, in effect, that, there's no problem, the economy is going to start growing. Is she going to have a Baghdad Bob moment, where Baghdad Bob, as it was saying that Iraq was going to defeat America, the great Satan and all that stuff, and as they were, we were in, coming into, Baghdad. Is Janet Yellen going to have a Baghdad Bob moment where she can no longer say that things are good and the economy is growing and we're going to have a better, brighter future and all that?
Well, I don't see how she can think the economy is going to start growing. What's going to make it grow? Investment. Why should firms be investing when the consumers don't have any money? There's no retail sales. I mean, if you look at all the reported closings of retail stores, Macy's and Sears and all of the big kinds of retailers closing hundreds of stores, there's no economy there. And so I think it's just part of the rah-rah talk. Now, they may continue monkeying the economic statistics to create a picture of an economy that's still going along at some low level. But other than that, other than a monkeyed picture, a fabricated statistical picture, I don't see what can drive the economy. Allegedly, everywhere else in the world is going down too. So what's going to push the American economy up? Nothing that I know of.
Are they going to have to reverse course on this quantitative easing, this taper talk where they're tapering, or are they just going to get they're going to hand other countries money like, France or Great Britain or, Portugal or somebody else to buy our debt to make it look like it's being sold? What do you suppose is going to happen? I mean, aren't we reaching an inflection point here?
Well, a lot of funny things are going on. The reason for quantitative easing was to keep the bond prices high and the interest rates low. That both helped the balance sheet of the banks and it helped the Treasury finance its huge deficits at a very low cost. So, and the notion was if you didn't have that quantitative easing, the interest rates would be higher. But they've cut the quantitative easing dramatically from 85 billion to 45 billion. But the interest rates haven't exploded. In other words, it's almost cut in half the monthly purchases. But you don't see any impact from that.
Why?
Nothing that's the question. Why? It almost says it was never needed, or else it says it's still going on in some way.
That nobody can see.
It's not revealed. I mean, I don't know what's exactly going on. I'm just pointing out it's a puzzle. If we had to have 85 billion a month to keep the interest rates where the Fed wanted them, and now we can do essentially the same thing with 45 billion, and it's going to go all the way to zero soon, then what changed? Certainly not the demand for treasuries didn't go up. If the Fed has to buy 141 billion and launder them through Belgium, clearly the demand for treasuries hasn't gone up. So the whole thing needs an explanation, but you never get the financial press to look at these kinds of things and raise these questions and go ask and interview and try to get to the bottom of it. And I can't do all of that. I mean, if I get on the plane, fly to Washington and ask the Fed, they're not going to tell me anything. But the financial press could have made an issue of this.
But they won't, and they don't.
They haven't. And so what really is going on? It's a good question that I can't answer.
Well, let's move on to Ukraine and get your thoughts on that. The headlines, I'm just going to read you a few that just came out here in the last day or two. And, there's talk of there's a deal, another deal, energy deal between Russia and China. There's also Russia moving, money home out of European banks. They're just moving it home because they're afraid of, increased sanctions. Also, there's bail-ins that they have instituted a policy over there. Of course, that may or may not have something to do with it too. East Ukraine has basically said we are independent. The Russia now is saying that they are going to keep U.S. astronauts from using the space station, and the reason why is because the Ukrainian sanctions, and they look like they're ratcheting up. It just looks bad to me. I mean, there's been people saying, oh, this is going to be a skirmish, this is going to be a big deal. It looks bad for the dollar anyway. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Washington badly miscalculated with this whole Ukraine business. And it was an act of hubris and arrogance and stupidity. And they were mad at Russia for blocking their attack on Syria and blocking their attack on Iran. And they said, oh, we'll teach them, we'll give them trouble in their own backyard, and they won't be able to get in our way anymore. But the consequences, particularly of the sanction threat, which has not really happened yet, the sanctions that have been imposed are meaningless. But the threat of them, I think, convinced Russia that being in the dollar system was not in their interest and that they were going to leave it. And if the Europeans wanted their natural gas, they'll have to pay in rubles. So I think what Obama has done with rattling the sanction threat is to force the BRICS, the big countries that were going to be independent of the dollar system, to accelerate and get this organized quicker. So you see deals with Russia and China, Russia and Iran. You see the drawing out of the European banks of Russian assets. So they're just going to leave the system. So that means a void in demand for dollars. And if China and India and Brazil and South Africa also leave the system, it's an even larger void. So the demand for dollars will drop, and this will put pressure on the exchange value. Now, another aspect that's very interesting is, the United States no longer has a space station. And the United States can't even put its own satellites in orbit. It has to use Russian rocket engines. So what the Russian government has said, oh, sanctions, okay, well, unless you can give us bulletproof word assurances that you're not using our rockets for military missiles, we're not going to sell you anymore. So here you have the whole collapse of the American satellites, because we won't have any way, we no longer have the capability of putting satellites up or reaching a space station. We don't have a space station. We have to use the Russian. We're now technologically inferior to the Russians. So,
way to go, Mr. President. Thank you.
So why doesn't somebody tell the White House, hey, don't go threatening the Russians? I mean, how are we going to get our satellites up? I mean, how can we spy on people? When the ones up there wear out or get out of orbit or whatever, what are we going to do? How are we going to get another one up there? Well, Washington isn't capable of any serious thought because they're all full of arrogance and hubris, and we're the superpower and the exceptional people and the indispensable, and they must believe it.
When this move away from, there's another, just to back up your point, is a reporting on Zero Hedge that they had a de-dollarization meeting between, some of the principal players are China and Iran and Russia, and of course that's been going on for a while. But what does this mean? What's the ultimate end when the dollar is, when they de-dollarize, the world? What happens to our cost of living, our standard of living here in America for John Doe?
Well, if you find a large percentage of foreign trade no longer conducted in dollars, then the demand for dollars has dropped, but the supply hasn't. So the price would drop unless the Fed can find some way to rig it. They can always get the Japanese to print yen to buy the dollar. They can get the Europeans to print euros to buy the dollar. They can get the British to print pounds to buy the dollar. But for how long? Because all of that can come back on those individual countries. They can lose control of inflation in their own countries. They can find that simply inflating paper money everywhere when the goods and services aren't growing commensurate, that this is a good way to bring the destruction home to them.
Let's say they say, we're not going to print pounds or sterling or euros or yen, or we're not printing our dollars. So we know how this is going to end, and we're not going to do it. So what happens then? What happens when the world stops using the dollar? That's what I want to get to.
Well,
so people can plan on this.
It's what I've already said. Any significant part of the world stops. The price of the dollar falls because the demand for dollars falls. And it would also mean that the dollar would no longer be the reserves in the central banks of these countries. China, which has enormous dollars, would be moving away from them, just like Russia. And if the rest of the BRICS go along with this, India, Brazil, South Africa. And so if the dollar is not performing the role of reserve currency because significant parts of the world have abandoned it, then it is no longer worth what it's worth right now.
How close are we to that?
The import cost of all the goods for America would rise. And when you see how import dependent we are, it would mean a substantial increase in the real cost of living for Americans. But their income isn't rising. So the prices will be, but not their income. So you would see a lot more poverty, a lot more hardship, a lot less social stability. In other words, it would be a disaster.
How close are we to this disaster?
I can't predict it. It's gone on longer than I thought. But with the announcements of the Russian government, it looks like finally the movement is going to start rather than just talking about starting it. And once it starts, it may pick up a lot of momentum. But then again, I didn't know that the Fed could rig interest rates for so long while it's continued to print huge sums of money. Normally that causes interest rates to explode upward. I didn't know the Fed could rig the gold market the way it does. It never occurred to me the Fed would sell naked shorts to stop the gold price from rising. And I wouldn't have expected the plunge protection team to go in and rig the stock market by buying stock S&P futures every time the market starts to correct. So what else can they do? I don't know. They may surprise us again. But all it would mean is a bad situation continues to fester, the bubbles get bigger, so when they finally do go, the explosion is that much larger.
And speaking of explosions, last question. Do you think we could have real war in the Ukraine? I mean, it just sounds to me that, the Russians are going to fight a proxy war with their guys who are pro-Russia in the East. The Ukrainians are sending their military in. Could we end up in a proxy war or a real war in the Ukraine with the Russians, basically?
Well, there's a risk of that. I think that what we've learned is that Ukraine doesn't really have an army. And the violence has been committed by those paramilitary forces, militias, formed under the right sector, the neo-Nazi group. And they, of course, are not that substantial and would be no match for Russian troops. They may not even be much of a match for the home guard, the various parts of eastern and southern Ukraine have managed to put together. I don't think we will come to a war with Russia over Ukraine unless we start putting nuclear missiles in Ukraine, anti-ballistic missile sites, and that particular government, the stooge government we installed, loses its place to these neo-Nazis who seem to be better organized, in which case Russia would see a direct strategic threat and would probably simply come in and take the whole country in order not to have American nuclear missiles there. So unless we did something that dumb, and of course, if the Russians did come in, then the idiots in Washington would say, "Oh, we can't lose face," blah blah, and there you could have a nuclear war come out of this. I think on the whole, what the Americans are going to do now is just try to keep baiting Russia, demonizing Putin, and use this to restart the Cold War, because they need to have large expenditures on the military security complex. It's a massive entity, and with the wars in the Middle East winding down, we're withdrawing now from Afghanistan, and we don't seem to be able to get another big war going. They need some way to spend money, and so they will use the Ukraine to restart the Cold War so they can load up Eastern Europe and the Baltics and Georgia and wherever else with military spending to keep the American military security complex rolling in the dough, which gets recycled back to Congress and the White House in political campaign contributions.
Man,
so it's a corrupt system where the U.S. government gives the taxpayers' money to the military security complex, in the name of some threat. Now it's going to be the Russian threat all over again. And then some of that money recycles back to Congress and presidential candidates and to get them elected and keep them in office. So that is what my prediction is. The American government, Washington, as we call it, is probably not up to fighting a conventional war in the Ukraine with Russia. And despite all the bragging and macho talk, they probably don't want the risk of a nuclear war. And so most likely they will use this crisis. They'll keep it festering. They'll keep the propaganda coming hard and fast. They'll keep demonizing Russia and Putin. And they'll use it to create in the public's mind this threat. And we have to beef up the Baltics and Eastern Europe and so forth.
A lot of moving pieces on this chessboard, very complicated. Thank you for shedding, some analysis and light on it for us here on USA Watchdog. And you didn't tell me to do this, and I want to tell people about this. I know your site, you have to have a dedicated server. You have to have a lot of security because I'm sure you're attacked all the time. I know you don't say that. You don't have to admit to that. But what you need is donations. So I just want to tell people that you should, if you can, donate to Paul Craig Roberts to keep him putting out information and analysis that we all can digest and use and help us plan our lives and plan what's going on. If we can't do anything else, we can at least plan for the eventuality of what's going to happen, particularly with the dollar. Thank you again, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, for helping us.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you guys.